Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Tefillin, and something happened to me just now that I don't think ever happened to me since I started saying the share online. I guess there's always a first time, and that is that I opened up my Mishnah Berurah to start saying share, and I was intending on saying a double share and saying share on Lamud Zayin, Amud Beis, as well as Lamud Ches, Amud Aleph. And then lo and behold, when I looked at my Mishnah Berurah, I always make a little mark in my Mishnah Berurah where I completed the previous share. And much to my surprise, I realized that we never did Lamud Zayin, Amud Aleph. I never said share on Lamud Zayin, Amud Aleph. So here I was about to start saying share on Lamud Zayin, Amud Beis, and I just found out that we're actually saying share on Lamud Zayin, Amud Aleph. So with that interesting little hakdama, let's go to Lamed Vav Amud Beis, Siman Chav Zayin, Sif Gimel. That's where we seem to be holding. Looks like we finished the previous share at Sif Gimel. So let's go and we'll see how far we can get. Says the Mechaber, 2 lines off the bottom, Lamed Vav Amud Beis. Haminig hanochain. The proper minig is Lisakein, to set up the Tefillin, Shehama'abarta, so that the Ma'abarta Sheba Haritzua. We're talking about the Tefillin Shel Yad. We've been discussing the proper placement of the Tefillin Shel Yad. So, if you remember, we have on the Shel Yad and on the Shel Rosh, we have the part of the bias known as the Ma'abarta. The Ma'abarta is this place over here, very aptly named the Ma'avarta. It's the part of the bias that the Ritzua travels through, right? It goes into the bias over here and it cuts across. So that part is called the Ma'abarta. Says the Mechaber, Haminig hanochain, the proper minig is l'sakein, to put on the Tefillin, Ma'abarta sheba haritzua iveres, so that the Ma'abarta, which is the part of the bias that the Ritzua goes through, Tehe Munachas, should be lying Litzad HaKosef, up towards the shoulder, V'HaKetzitza, and the rest of the bias, the Ketzitza, so again, up on top over here, we have the Ma'abarta, and then down below the Ma'abarta, we have the rest of the foundation of the bias. That's called the Ketzitza, V'HaKetzitza Litzad Hayad, and the rest of the Ketzitza should be lying facing downwards towards the hand, so that when we put the Tefillin on, and of course, that hopefully will be the topic of later in the shir, of course, we don't put on the Tefillin on top of our clothing. I'm doing it now for illustrative purposes only. So we put on the Tefillin so that you could see the Ma'abarta over here is facing up towards the shoulder, while the Ketzitza is facing down towards the Yad. Okay, says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Yud Beis V'Ketzitza V'Iter. Now a lefty, who we're going to discuss later on, hopefully, Haminiach Tefillin Mimi She'ena Iter. If you have a lefty who's borrowing a righty's Tefillin, or you have a righty that's borrowing a lefty's Tefillin. Now, the problem with that is, we learned already previously that when you put on the Shel Yad, again, we'll just tie this on over here quickly. We learned already earlier that when you put on the Shel Yad, the kesher, you can see the kesher over here, the kesher is supposed to be next to the guf. It's supposed to be next to the heart. Now, I am a righty. I put on my Tefillin on my left arm. Now, let's say a lefty came to me and he wanted to borrow my Tefillin. Now, we just learned that the Mavarta is supposed to be up and the Ketzitza is supposed to be down. Well, what happens if I take these Tefillin and I try to put them on my left hand? Well, now, where's the kesher? See the kesher over there? Now the kesher is away from my body, right? Try to position it so you can see it on the camera. Everything is mirror image. See, here's the kesher. So now the kesher is away from my body, and the bias is towards the body. We don't want that. It's not supposed to be that way. So therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, the iter, a lefty, hameniach tefillin, who's putting on tefillin that he borrowed, mimisha ena iter, from somebody who's not a lefty, he borrowed a righty's tefillin, or the other way, the ena yachal lahaitzi haritzua ulakava kedin. Now, he doesn't know, he's not a cipher, so he doesn't know how to remove the ritzua, how to untie the kesher and remove the ritzua from the bias and to retie it in the manner of a lefty or the other way. Ayin b'biur halacha, he says, take a look at the biur halacha. What should such a person do? And this is a shaila that does come up. And if you take a look at the biur halacha actually says that in that case, the lefty, let's say, should taka flip the tefillin upside down. Okay, so I just did that here. Flip the tefillin upside down. Now the mabarta is facing down towards the hand. The ketzitza is facing up towards the shoulder. But now the yud is in the proper place. Now the kesher, the yud, is against the body. So the biur halacha comes out over here, and I could read it to you. It is in Dibur HaMaschel HaMinig HaNachayin L'Sakein. It's all the way at the bottom of Lamed Vav Beis. Chavetz Chaim says, "B'chol zeh, Misha hu iter, somebody's a lefty. Ve'ein lo rak tefillin shel eine iter, and he only has access to a righty's tefillin, or lehepech, or the other way. He's a righty who only has access to a lefty's tefillin. Yuchal lahapech, he could turn the tefillin over, ulahaniach haketzitza l'tzad hakosef, and to put the ketzitza pointing up towards the shoulder, v'hama'abarta l'tzad hayad, and the ma'abarta pointing down towards the hand. Kain kasvu b'tshuvas shvus Yaakov. He brings this down from the shvus Yaakov from Rabbi Yaakov Emden. U'ba'artzas hachayim. Ki zeh bevadai toiv yoser, because that is certainly better, says the Chavetz Chaim. Mima sheyaniach kach, it's better than putting on the tefillin in the proper orientation with the ma'abarta up and the ketzitza down, v'yia tefillin samach lalev, but then the bias of the tefillin will be close to the guf, it will be inside towards the guf, v'yia kesher ayud chutzala, while the kesher of the yud will be outside the bias, the bias facing away from the heart, facing away from the guf. Ukemoisha kasva gra. Yeah, okay. And if you go down later, no, that's all. That's what you need to see right now. So that's how the Chavetz Chaim paskins. The Chavetz Chaim says you're a lefty and you have to borrow a righty's tefillin. You're a righty, you have to borrow a lefty's tefillin. Flip the bias upside down so that the ketzitza is facing up towards the shoulder and the mabarta is facing down towards the yad. And that way you will keep the kesher facing towards the guf. Okay. Now we go to Sif Daled, bottom line of the Mechaber, Lamed Vav Amid Beis. Says the Mechaber, Lo yehei davar chaytzeitz bein tefillin libisaroi. There should not be anything interposing between the bias of the tefillin and your body. Lo yishna shel yad, in the context of this halacha, there's no difference between the tefillin shel yad, lo yishna shel roish, or the tefillin shel roish. You're not supposed to have anything being chaytzeitz between the bias and the guf. Haga, the Ramah says, v'dafka bat tefillin. This halacha really only applies to the bias of the tefillin. Aval baritzuais, but when it comes to the ritzuais, to the straps of the tefillin, ein lahakbid, he brings down from the Rashba that there is no need to be makbid, but the Mishnah Berurah is going to go into this in a little bit greater detail. Let's take a look here in the Mishnah Berurah. He's cutting Yud Gimel near the bottom of Lamed Vav Amid Beis. Lo yehei, there should not be any chatzitza between the tefillin and the guf. Where does this come from? Says the Chavetz Chaim Diksiv, because it's written in the pasuk Al Yodecha. It says, "Ukishartem la'os al yadacha," you should tie the tefillin as a sign onto your hand. It means, literally, it should go on the hand. It doesn't mean literally hand, it's the arm, but it should go on the arm. And it should not go on top of something else that's on the arm. Tefillin sharosh, and in the context of the Tefillin sharosh ksiv, the pasuk writes, "Bein einecha." You should put it between the eyes, which we know doesn't mean between the eyes literally. It means up here, aligned with between the eyes. But again, on the guf bein einecha, not on something else. Eis katan yud daled, davar chaytzeitz. There should not be anything interposing. Afilu chatzitza koldehu. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this means even something very minute. V'nachar lizar lechatchila, and lechatchila we should be careful, says the Chavetz Chaim. Afilu bekina chaya, even if somebody is afflicted with some kind of lice, even a kina chaya, there is reason to say that a live insect, a live creature like a louse, would not be a chatzitza since it's not fixed in its place. It's able to move around. So there is such a havamina to say that maybe a kina chaya would not be a chatzitza. Says the Chavetz Chaim, no. V'nachan lizar, it is proper to take care lechatchila afilu bekina chaya, even a live louse, shelo yehei mafsik ben tefillin labasar, it should not form an interposition between the tefillin and the flesh. Val kol panim bekina mesa, certainly when it comes to a dead louse, va'afar or dirt, yesh li zaher, we should take care that there should be nothing, even a kolshu, even a very minute amount, there should be nothing interposing between the tefillin and the guf. V'alkein, therefore, yesh again, there are those who have the minig lirchaitz mekayim anachas tefillin, to wash the area of the body that they put the tefillin on, to make sure there is no chatzitza. Kosav b'sefer revid hazahav. Now, of course, somebody once asked me, a bacher once asked me, but how about the hairs on the arm? That's part of the guf. That's certainly not a chatzitza. Kosav b'sefer revid hazahav. It is written in the sefer revid hazahav. Near it would appear damasha ritzua chitzetzes l'pa'amim bein tefillin libisarei. When somebody has that the ritzua of the tefillin, the ritzuas themselves, interpose between the body and the tefillin. How would that be? Well, it would be that way if somebody went like this. Somebody puts on the tefillin, so he goes and he ties it onto his arm, like so, and then he comes around, and then on the side of the guf over here, if he comes around with the ritzua under the bias. The problem wearing black. Maybe I'll take it off. You know what? You can't really see what I'm doing. The whole reason I wear the chalat when I say shir is because of kavod HaTorah and kavod HaTzibur. But in this case, it is not kavod HaTorah and kavod HaTzibur because it takes away from teaching what we have to teach. So it comes off. And now it'll be actually over white. So it'll be even easier to see. Okay, somebody puts on tefillin, so that he does this, but then he comes around with the ritzua and goes under the shirt out of the way. You can see what I did over here. Now we have the ritzua over here passing underneath the bias. See? So now the bias is actually laying on the ritzua. So he brings down here from the Sefer Revid Hazav. Kasav b'Sefer Revid Hazav, near it would seem, Tamasha ritzua chaytzeses l'pa'amim bein tefillin l'besarai. If you have the ritzua of the tefillin interposing between the bias and the basar, loy mikri chatzitza, that is not considered a chatzitza. The min b'minai einay chaytzetz, because things of like nature are not a chatzitza. So this is tefillin, that's tefillin. It doesn't make a chatzitza. However, from the levushay srad that we brought down earlier, who says specifically that you should not do this, it's clear from his writing that you should be machmir lechatchila and you should not do that. Ois Katan Tezvav, the Mechaber said in the context of this halacha of a chatzitza, there's no difference between the Tefillin shel Yad and the Tefillin shel Rosh. Loishta shel Rosh. Kasa b'sefer Machzah Shekel, we see in the Machzah Shekel, he writes, Vera olai ha'maisa, it is evil to me, this maisa, it's evil to me, this that goes on. Shal oisan ha'anoshim, those people, shemegadlin b'loi roisehen, who grow their hair very long, they grow their chops. Milavadkiu derech shachatz v'gaiva. Not only is it not good because it's derech shachatz v'gaiva, it's grub and it's gaiva, it's haughtiness. Ayin mashakasav b'yardeh simin kof ayin ches, if aleph, like we can see over there. But still in all, there's another problem. Yesh by iser b'hanachas tefillin. Not only is it something which speaks ill of the character of the person, his priorities are not right, and he's trying to dress himself up and make himself look fancy and showing off and derech shachatz v'gaiva. But not only is that a problem, yesh by iser b'hanachas tefillin. He's doing something which is aser in the context of Hilchas Tefillin. The keved the gedolin harbe, because since he's allowing the hair to grow excessively, lekala meimar b'hu hainu revisayu. We can no longer look at that hair and say that that hair is the derech, that it's normal. V'chotzitzim, and therefore that hair would constitute a chatzitza. In other words, as long as we keep the hair in proper condition so that we consider it, this is normal hair growth. Normal hair growth does not constitute a chatzitza. But once we reach the point where it's abnormal and it's excessive, now it's not derech gidulai anymore. Once it's not derech gidulai, now it does form a chatzitza. Excuse me. Okay. Ayin Sham. Ubalav chatzitza nami. Then the Chavetz Chaim says, and even if we're not going to worry that excessive hair is actually halachically a chatzitza, but there's another problem. B'shvil hani sa'arais hamerubim, because of this excessive hair, I efshel etzamtzem sheyu mehudakin umunachen al mekayman kadin. We know that when we put the tefillin sharosh on, we have to tighten it, right? It's supposed to be like a keshira. It's supposed to be firmly emplaced on the head. But if you have a lot of hair, it doesn't sit on the head well. It's always loose. And that's also a problem, says the Chavetz Chaim. Okay, Ois Katan Tez Zayin, the Ramah said, the Mechaber brings down this halacha that we have to worry about a chatzitza. Says the Ramah, the chatzitza is only a problem by the tefillin themselves, by the batim, but not by the ritzuas. The words of the Ramah were, Aval beritzuas en lahakbid. There's no reason to be concerned about this when it comes to the ritzuas, and he brought this down from the Chuvas HaRashba. Says the Chavetz Chaim is Katan Tez Zayin, ein lahakbid. The Achroinim Kasva, the Achroinim write, de ein lahakel rak b'mekayim hakrichos. Say the Achroinim, when the Ramah says that we don't have to worry about a chatzitza when it comes to the ritzuas, he means, let's say, over here, on the arm, when we do the windings of the ritzuas, the krichos. Over here, we don't have to worry about a chatzitza. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, Avama sheshayach la keshira, but the part of the ritzuas that actually form the keshira, that actually tie the tefillin onto the arm. So that's over here. This part over here, that's the part that actually ties the bias onto the arm. Or in the case of the shalrosh, the ritzuas that go around the head, that actually tie the tefillin shalrosh onto the head. Over there, Avamasha Shaykh La Keshira, Yesh Lahachmer, we should be Machmer, and he brings this down from the Lavush, the Elas Tamid, the Taz, the El Yarabba. He says it's also mashmer this way from the Gra, Yesh Lahachmer Af Beritzuas Bein B'Shal Yad Ubein B'Shal Rosh. The parts of the Ritzuas that actually tie the Tefillin Shal Yad and the Tefillin Shal Rosh on, over there we do have to be concerned with a chatzitza. The Kasu Techachas Megula, and the Achronim write very openly, they give Musar, Ala Manichin Tefillin al Gabe Peya Nochris, on those who would put on their Tefillin Sharosh over a Peya Nochris. It's a wig, but it's, what's it called? For a man, it's called a, the English word flew out of my head, but you all know it. So it's talking about a wig that a man would wear, a peya nachris, a bald person would have some kind of a fake headpiece. Hanikra paruka, that was called a paruka. So the Achronim write that you can't put the tefillin onto this paruka. And this is true even if it's only the straps of the shalroish that are going on the wig, but the bias itself is sitting on the head. They still say you should not do it. Nevertheless, Mashma Medivrei HaMagen Avram, the Chavetz Chaim says it is implied from the words of the Magen Avram, V'achayodam, and the Chayodam, Dem yesh lo baka b'roshei. Let's say somebody has some sort of a skin affliction on his head. V'rak b'makom sheharitzuos munachim. But where is the makkah? It's only where the ritzuos go around the head. But the makkah is not where the bias is going to sit on the head. In that case, in that case, we would be matir for this individual to put the straps of the shalrosh over bandages. So he has some kind of an affliction on the scalp or on the skin of the head. He could put on bandages, put the ritzuos of the shalyad of the shalrosh on those bandages, as long as the bias will sit directly on the head. Or maybe on some kind of a very thin cap, and make a bracha. Even though there is a chatzitza between the ritzuos and the person. Since where the bias is, there is no chatzitza. And similarly, when it comes to the tefillin shalyad, if somebody has some kind of a skin affliction, even if that affliction is over here or over here, underneath the ritzua, where the ritzua actually ties the tefillin on, he would be permitted to put those ritzuas over a bandage and to make a bracha, as long as the bias itself is directly on the body. However, in the case of the tefillin shalyad, you have another concern, which is that after you put the tefillin on over these bandages or what have you, you then have to put something else on top of the tefillin shalyad, kedei sheyiskayim, in order to fulfill the dictate of the pasuk when it says l'chala ois, that the tefillin shalyad are supposed to be a sign for you, v'loy la'acherim la'ois. In other words, what the Chavetz Chaim is saying is, there's another requirement when it comes to the tefillin shalyad, which we will learn about a little bit later, and that is the tefillin shalyad are supposed to be covered. The tefillin sharosh, we're going to see, are not supposed to be covered. People are supposed to be able to see the tefillin sharosh. Kishem Hashem Nikra Alecha says that the nations of the world will see that we wear the name of Hashem on ourselves on the tefillin sharosh. But the tefillin shalyad is l'chol la'os. It's a sign for you. V'loy la'acherim la'os. So the tefillin shalyad are supposed to be covered. So if you put the tefillin shalyad directly on the body, so then fine, you put it directly on the body and then you cover it with a beged. Now we're saying that in certain cases, you could put the ritzuos over a beged. So if you're putting it on over your beged, what are you going to cover it with? Says the Chavetz Chaim, you have to make sure to then cover them up. Now, what have we seen here so far? Because this has been a little bit complex. So the Mechaber told us a halacha that there can't be a chatzitza between you and the tefillin. The Ramah came and the Ramah said that halacha only applies to the bias. It applies to the bottom of the tefillin, but not the ritzuos. The Mishnah Berurah came along, and the Mishnah Berurah told us in the name of the Achronim that you should be makbid, that the part of the ritzuos that actually make the kesher, so the part of the ritzuos that go around the arm up here and actually tie the bias to the arm, and the ritzuos that encircle the head that actually tie the tefillin onto the head, by those ritzuas, you should be makbid not to have a chatzitza. Same way you don't have a chatzitza by the bias, you shouldn't have a chatzitza by the part of the ritzuas that form the kesher. Then the Mishnah Berurah went weiter, and he told us that we could be makel by somebody who has a makkah. If somebody has some kind of an affliction, so he has a need, then he brought down from the Magen Avram and the Chai Yodam that in that case you could be makel, where the ritzuas go around the arm to tie them on, or where the ritzuas encircle the head to tie the Tefillin Sharosh on. In that case, you could be makel. Okay. Now we go to Sif Hey. Says the Mechaber, second line down in the Shulchan Aruch. Adam shehu olol linizilus, a person who has a problem that the Mechaber refers to as nizilus. I don't know precisely what nizilus means, but let's take a look right away at the Mishnah Berurah's Cut in Yud Zayin. Olol linizilus. He brings down over here from the Taz. He says, Pirish, what does this mean? Sheyesh loy machayiv, he has an affliction, a mechayish baroshai, or some kind of illness, a weakness in his head. Vim yegala roshai, if he uncovers his head, yazik loy hakarirus, the cold or the draft will cause him harm. I don't know precisely what it means. Kevan shehu onus, since this person has an onus, he has a problem, he has a physical problem. Yachal lismaich al harashba, this person could rely on the shitas harashba, the svirale who holds, the ein chash pachatzitza. The Rashba doesn't hold of this problem that the Mechaber brought down, that there cannot be a chatzitza by Tefillin. The Rashba holds a chatzitza is not a problem. So this person who has this kind of illness, he could rely on the Rashba, who holds v'loy nemar beinei necha elo l'sayim lehem makom, that when the pasuk says ukishartam la'isa yodecha v'ayu l'toitafais beinei necha, it doesn't mean to tell me that it has to be directly on the body. All it is giving me a siman for where the tefillin are supposed to be located. That whole problem doesn't exist by the Tefillin Sharosh. Debahu, because by the Tefillin Sharosh ksiv it says in the pasuk, "V'ro kol amei haaretz ki Shem Hashem nikra alecha." Everybody is supposed to see the Tefillin Sharosh. But still in all, the person who's putting the Tefillin Sharosh on top of a beged, he would have to cover it up because of Marasayin. Not everybody is going to understand that he's doing it because of a sickness. But we jumped a little bit ahead of ourselves. So let's go back into the Mechaber Sif Hey. Adam shehu olol linizilus. This person who has this kind of affliction, where the draft or the cold will cause him pain if he uncovers his head, so that if he would have to put even the bias of the Tefillin Sharosh directly on his head, lo yanichem klal, he will not be able to, so he simply won't put on a Tefillin Sharosh. Yesh lahater lo lahanyach Tefillin Sharosh ala koiva dak hasamach l'rosh. By this person, we could give him a heter to put on his Tefillin Sharosh onto some kind of a thin cap, v'yachasem, and then cover the tefillin over mipnei haroyim, because of marasayin, people who will see that he's putting the Tefillin Sharosh not directly on his head, but on top of a cap. So what's the Mechaber saying? The Mechaber is telling you, I just told you in Sif Daled that you're not allowed to have a chatzitza. At the same time, I'm telling you that somebody who has an oinus, somebody who has a physical oinus, which will prevent him from putting on his tefillin, if we require him to put the Tefillin Sharosh directly on his guf, that person could have a heter, and he could put even the bias, not like the Mishnah Berurah just said before, the ritzuas, even the bias, he could put on top of a thin cap. Why? Because this person, since he has an oinus, he could rely on the Shitas HaRashba. The Shitas HaRashba is that there is no such halacha. There's no concern of a chatzitza by tefillin. That's the Shitas HaRashba. So this person could rely on the Shitas HaRashba. However, if he is putting his tefillin on top of a thin cap, he has to make sure to cover his head and cover his tefillin so that people should not see it, because they don't know that he has an oinus. Haga, says the Ramah, somebody who does put on his tefillin in this fashion, lo yivarech al shel rosh, he should not make a bracha on the shel rosh. Rak Yavarech al Shal Yad Lahaniach. He should just make Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvaysav v'tzivanu lahaniach tefillin before he puts on the Shal Yad, and that bracha will cover the Shal Rosh as well, but he will not make an al mitzvah tefillin on his Shal Rosh. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Ois kat yud ches. Tefillah Shal Rosh, then yesh lo maka b'yad. The Mechaber addressed the Shal Yad and the Shal Rosh. How about somebody who has a makkah, who has an affliction on his arm? He has an affliction right where the bias of the tefillin goes, right on the bicep. And that makkah covers up the entire bicep. So he's left with nowhere to put the Shal Yad. So such a person would be allowed to put his tefillin on top of a bandage. Even the bias he would be allowed to put on top of a bandage. But he would not make a bracha. Because this shitas harashba is not in accordance with the majority of the Rishonim. The majority of the Rishonim hold that there is a problem of a chatzitza by tefillin. This person would make 2 brachas on the Shal Rosh, like we learned earlier in the Ramah, according to the Shitas Ramah, that we always make a lohaniach before the Shal Yad, and then an al mitzvah tefillin before the Shal Rosh, and the lohaniach that we make before the Shal Yad goes on the Shal Rosh as well. So this person who can't make a bracha on his Shal Yad because he's putting on his Shal Yad on top of a retia, on top of a bandage, shaloi kedas roiv harishonim, so he can't make a bracha, so he'll now have to make 2 brachas when he puts on the Shal Rosh. He'll make a lohaniach and an al mitzvahs when he puts on his Shal Rosh. Ach yilbash ala tefillah shel yad milamala beged acher kedei lechasoisam. He'll also have to put another beged on top of the Shal Yad. Now the Mishnah Berurah says something very interesting. He says, V'dafka al retia. This person who has an affliction on his arm, and therefore we are allowing him to put even the bias on top of a retia. A retia is a bandage. Says the Chavetz Chaim, dafka a retia. He can only put it on top of a bandage, but he can't put it on top of his shirt, the way I have it over here. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah inside. V'dafka al retia. He's only allowed to put the Shal Yad on top of a bandage. Aval lahaniach tefillin al chalukai. But to actually put the tefillin over his shirt or over his garment, yesh oimrim da'aser. There are those that say that that would be aser, and he brings this down from the Artzas HaChaim, and he says that it is implied that way from the Chai Adam as well. Yesh oimrim da'aser afilu b'yesh lo'maka, even by a person who has a makkah, va'afilu yilbash alav beged acher, and even if you subsequently cover the tefillin up with another beged to be mekayim l'chala ois v'loyla acherim la'ois. Now, what is the reason for this? Again, very interesting halacha. What we're saying is like this. We're saying there's a halacha of chatzitza, but somebody who has an oinis, somebody who has a makkah, and if we require him to put the bias of the tefillin directly on his skin, he will not be able to put on tefillin. Such a person, we're matter him to put the tefillin on top of a retia, on top of a beged, on top of a bandage. Says the Mishnah Berurah, only a bandage, not a beged. Why not? So I saw brought down because the tefillin shal yad are supposed to be put on a place that is normally covered. Part of that chiyuv is that the tefillin shal yad is supposed to be on a part of the body that is normally covered. But if you put it on top of your shirt is not normally covered. So now you're not putting, in a way, you're not fulfilling even if you then put your jacket over it. Still, the tefillin are sitting on a place that is not normally covered, because you walk around in your shirt sleeves. So therefore, you could put it on a bandage, but not a shirt. Why could you put it on a bandage? because a bandage is something that goes directly on the guf, and then gets covered by a shirt. So the bandage is not a problem, but the shirt is a problem. Okay. Ois cotton yud tes. Ois cotton yud tes. The Mechaber said this person who has a makkah, he could put the shel roish on a koiva dak, on a thin cap. Says the Mishnah Berurah, aval al koiva ova also lahanicham. But you cannot put the tefillin shel roish on a thick cap. So no baseball cap. Reb Moshe, I'm thinking about you right now. Reb Moshe, I'm thinking gray baseball cap. So no, you cannot put the tefillin shel roish on a baseball cap, even if you have a makkah chas v'chalila. Why? Once you're going to put it on a thick cap, then we're afraid that you're going to put the shel roish in the wrong place on the head, because you're not going to be able to feel where it's laying on the head, and you might put it too high. These words, makom sha'tinai roifes. Let me just find it inside again. Yeah, you might put it. You might not be able to feel makom sha'mayach shel tinek roifes, the area where a baby's head is soft. That's the area of the scalp called the fontanelle. That's the soft spot on a baby's head. We're going to see that's the high mark of the tefillin, cannot be higher than that. So if you try to put the shel roish on a thick cap, we're afraid you might put it higher than that. Ois katan chaf, the Ramah said that this person who has an oinus, yes, he could put even the bias on top of a thin cap, but the Ramah said he should not make a bracha on the shel roish. The Ramah said, rak yavarech al shel yad lahaniach, all he's going to do is make a lahaniach on the shel yad, but he's not going to make a bracha on the shel roish at all. Ois katan chaf, rak yavarech, v'yechavin lahoitzia shel roish. When he makes the bracha of lahaniach on the yad, he should have in mind that that bracha goes on the roish as well, which is what we always do. The Mishnah Berurah is explaining to us why does the Ramah rule that this person should not make a bracha on the shel roish? Because the rationale is, look, we have the Shitas HaMechaber. The Shitas HaMechaber is that we never make an independent bracha on the shel roish. We make it a lahaniach before we put on the shel yad, and that covers the putting on of the shel yad and the shel roish. The only time we make a bracha on the shel roish is if we were mafsik between the shel yad and the shel roish. That's the shitas hamechaber. So over here, we are putting on the shel roish in a manner that does not work according to Rav Rishonim. According to Rav Rishonim, we're not yotzeh with a chatzitza, so we don't want you to make a bracha on that putting on of the shel roish. Just make one bracha before you put on the shel yad, and have both tefillin in mind. V'ayin bebach v'olas tamid. The Chavetz Chaim says, take a look at the bach and the olas tamid. The mashban b'divrayhem. It is implied from their words. The nachan lizayer. It is proper to take care. Shal kol panim b'shas kriya shema utfila yeh b'loy chatzitza klal. It's proper to take care that if you're stuck in such a situation where you have an oinus and you have to put on your shel roish on top of a retia, or you have to put on your shel yad on top of a chatzitza, so at least during Kriya Shema and Shemona Esrei, we should try not to have any chatzitza between the bias of the yad and the bias, between the bias of the yad and the guf, and the bias of the roish and the guf. Okay, I'm going to stop over here at Sivav, and I'm going to endeavor to say another shir later today, and to make that shir a double shir. If I'm successful, then we will have done 3 pages today. I'm not promising. I will try. You've seen the Mazel Tov. Baruch Hashem, my daughter is a Kala, and making a Vart tomorrow night. Certainly anybody who wants to join. Yeshiva Staten Island, 1870 Drubger Road East, Staten Island, New York, 10309, 7 to 10. It would be my pleasure to greet anybody. So things are a little bit hectic, but I am going to endeavor to try and say the share that I originally intended to say today. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schos of limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shalom should send Yeshua's refuahs parnasa and shidduchim to all those in need. And we should be zeicher to see the Bias Gal Tzedek b'meherav Yameinu. Amen. Be well.